Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Chito community, wash processed Ecuador from Resident Coffee Roasters. And there's the bag right there. And Resident, based out of Gainesville, Florida. And this is their first ever appearance on this channel. They're a coffee roaster I had zero familiarity with going into this review. I had actually discovered this coffee roaster through Carl We Like Coffee's Instagram page, as it appears Carl has been a fan of this coffee roaster for a number of years now. So when I saw Resident release a couple of Ecuadorian coffees, it felt like a great opportunity to try them out for myself. So it'll be interesting to see how they turned out, as this right here is day 40. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee, I was actually surprised that this coffee turned out a fair bit more developed than I'd expected going into it, as this one definitely offered some slight roasty qualities that I feel like most people would align with being either on the very developed side of a light medium or on the lighter side of a medium, as this one was definitely pushing the spectrum of development quite a bit. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 14, first impression, and we opted for the V60, and that was the first takeaway I had of this coffee, was that there was definitely more development in the brew itself, as it was yielding nice results nonetheless, with a slightly savory but sugary forward profile, a slight honeyed bitterness and chocolate. Other than that though, I was definitely pulling out some slight roasty qualities to it as well, so there were some positives to take away, though I think I was just mostly taken aback by the overall development of this coffee. We continue on to day 17 as we opted for the Chemex, and once again, it was felt this time in a slightly heavier sense, as there's still some nice sweetness to the cup, but the savoriness continues to remain the dominant profile, with the slight sugary sweetness present on the back end. There's a slight bit more bitterness and smokiness that is hindering the rest of the cup, so as a result, it wasn't quite as good on the second impression, and I knew that there was going to be some work that needed to be done with this coffee, as on day 20 we opted for the April brewer, and once again, this continues to be something that did seem to be at the forefront of this coffee, especially with the rest of it being marred by the overall smoky quality to it, as the sweet and savory components are still present, but for the most part, outside of that, it's really dominated by lingering and lasting smokiness. It does offer a slight citric as well as lasting honey too, so for the most part, we're still getting mixed results with the coffee. Day 25, we opted for the V60 with some lower temperatures, and it's been pretty consistent so far, at least in one specific regard outside of the smokiness, and that's the tea-like savoriness being the dominant aspect. And no matter what sort of adjustments or no matter what sort of changes we had made, that was always dominating this cup, as it made a lot of sense. I believe they have something like a black tea or black boba tea listed on here, which was definitely something that was experienced within this coffee throughout. It didn't necessarily help the lower temperatures, as it only slightly toned down the smokiness, but as a result it was at the trade-off of the sweeter aspects, and it had a slight burnt popcorn taste, so this day was just okay. We continue on to day 28 as we opted for the Chemex, and there was a lot of consistency to this coffee, with those two things still seeming to have affected the roastiness as well as that very strong savory aspect to it. The best of the coffee does come after a lengthy cool down, with the strong savoriness still present in the listed black tea scents, but also a honeyed attribute too, and a little bit of citrus, and that gave this coffee just a little bit of depth, though it did require a fair bit of a cool down to kind of experience that, as a little bit of the smokiness at that time did dissipate. Day 31 through the V60 with our standard recipe, and this was the best I had experienced of this coffee, as I just kind of came to say that the trade-off in terms of the smokiness as well as the sweetness was something that I had to live with, given that other adjustments toned down the sweetness and some of the depth to this coffee, as it has the more pronounced black tea savoriness and that sharp honey quality, with the lingering citric component to it as well as that lingering smokiness. So for the most part, you just kind of have to take everything together if you really want the positives from this coffee, as most specifically the roasted qualities of it. Day 34 through the Chemex with our standard recipe, and I just decided to stick with the V60 from this point going forward, as the Chemex really seemed to accentuate a lot of the roasty qualities within this one. The cup itself is offering a slightly more toned down and diluted cup, with the robust tea savoriness continuing to dominate, and that just always seems to dominate. Those two factors really seemed to dominate this coffee. And on day 37, final notes, we have one more try through the V60, and it's been consistent with the adjustments. Smoky qualities, again, with a strong savoriness and a bit of a honeyed florality, as well as citric quality. Once the cup does cool down, a little bit more present within the finish. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have one level 4 and a bunch of level 3s. So let's go through those real quick. And we'll start with the finish level 4. So yes, this one definitely had a fair bit of the smokiness within the finish. And it's something that even once it does kind of dissipate, it's still very much something that you are experiencing, that roasted quality to this coffee. And for that reason, it's going to affect a lot of the rest of this tasting wheel. But for now, we'll just leave that finish there at that level 4 and start working through the rest. Sweetness, level 3. And even when it was on the sweeter side of things, I don't necessarily believe that it was ever going to score higher than that level 3. Highest was at the higher side of that level 3 mark, as I was hoping that given that this coffee offered a number of characteristics that sounded like they were going to be on the sweeter side of things, it did not necessarily yield those overall results, as I think once again the profile of this coffee lent itself towards maybe a slight bit less sweetness in general. Acidity, level 3. Certainly not the brightest coffee either, and I don't think that any sort of adjustments were going to bring out more brightness within this coffee, as I don't necessarily think that was the primary focus or expectations within this one. So level 3 always felt like a good place to put it, as it's a little bit more medium in terms of the brightness, as you still experience enough to kind of justify pushing it above that level 2, as I know we've scored level 2 for coffees in the past. So level 3 felt like the best place to put it. Florality, level 3. And that one I'm going to say is a little bit more on that honeysuckle side of things. I mentioned that slight burnt popcorn aspect, and oftentimes I describe honeysuckle as being reminiscent of the butter popcorn jelly bean, and that's once again something I was experiencing in this one, maybe in a little bit more diluted of a sense. But even then, I do have to say that it was one of the more prominent characteristics of this one, outside of the very strong savoriness as well as smoky quality to it. Berry fruit, level 3, and citrus fruit, level 3. I'll just discuss those real quick. And while I was making this tasting wheel, I said, okay, I can kind of experience maybe a slightly darker berry aspect. And once again, there's a slight bit of this citrus that's buried underneath the rest of the other qualities of this coffee. So I said, these are the most prominent and pronounced fruit characteristics, neither of which are very high or abundant, but they're at least prominent enough to justify a medium level on this tasting wheel. So that's why they're both scoring that level 3. Chocolate, level 3. That is a little bit more of a traditional, slightly more developed Ecuadorian coffee component to this one, a little bit more in a darker sense, as I felt like, okay, we're getting just a slight bit more of a heavier, darker chocolate component within this one. That's going to score a level 3 for me. Caramel, level 3. It does have a slight bit of that caramelized aspect to it as well, though I still continue to think that that's a byproduct of the overall just development of this coffee, as we've come around to the part that I need to discuss, and that's the smokiness, level 3. This one really did just seem to offer a lot of the more smoky, roasty qualities to it. And that's why I said to myself, I really want to tone this down, but I really want to accentuate the rest of the qualities. And I'm going to discuss that in my overall impressions of this coffee. But for right now, that's the best I could do, kind of getting it down to that level 3 mark. So definitely a fair bit of the roastiness within this one. Savory, level 3, and I think that that's going to be the most pronounced characteristic, and you could probably bump that up to a level 4, given that that savory black tea aspect was by far the most dominant component within this coffee. Even then, I just felt like I'm just going to leave it at that level 3, because there's nothing within this coffee I feel like that stands out to the point where you could say this just really seems to dominate in terms of the flavor profile. So level 3, higher side of the level 3. Body, level 3, a little bit more medium bodied, and I think that's something that I was expecting going into this one, especially since we did settle on the V60 as our preferred brewer. And then the final thing that's really worth discussing is the cleanliness, level 3. And I've said in the past that's the way a wash processed coffee is not going to score a level 4 in terms of the cleanliness, as if it's a Kenyan coffee that has a lot of the tomato-like attributes to it, or a Rwandan coffee that has a lot of the potato-like aspects to it, or a coffee that is hindered by an overall roasted quality to it. And that's the case with this one right here, as the smokiness I feel like did take away from the definition of the rest of this coffee. So for that reason, I did have to bump it down to a level 3. And outside of that, as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. Let me give this coffee some grace and start out with a couple of things. The next coffee that we're discussing from Resident, I liked a lot more than I enjoyed this one. And then the other thing, and I've always said this when it comes to more developed coffees, I don't think I'm really set up to brew and review more developed coffees in general, as I feel like my water is too soft, and I feel like the recipes and stuff I have don't necessarily lend themselves towards slightly more developed coffees. So I feel like for those reasons, it's not necessarily this coffee's issue, it's my issue on not being able to brew and get the best out of this coffee, which had I known those things going into it, then I would have maybe worked around and tried to find some ways of working with it better. But I, at this point, am a little inexperienced with being able to adjust these coffees to getting them to a point that I really like. So I'm going to place a lot of this one on me, as it isn't necessarily my type of coffee to begin with. I think the profile right from the start lent itself towards maybe not necessarily being my sort of coffee. Even if on paper it did sound like something I was going to enjoy, I feel like once you're pushing the spectrum a little further than I like, as I definitely skew on the lighter side of things, maybe not to the ultralight that a lot of people enjoy, but I oftentimes find really nice components within more developed coffees. So this one, I just seemed to struggle with the roastiness, as I could not seem to get away from that in general. So this one's not necessarily my thing, but I definitely wanted to give credit to Resident for a couple of things, as I feel like this is much more on me than it is on them. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, first place I do need to start is if you like a little bit more development to your coffee, because this one had that. But then outside of that, there are some positives that can be taken away, and the first direction I want to point somebody towards is a savory black tea like aspect, because this one had that in significant abundance, and it does have a little bit more of the, we'll say, less desired qualities that people that don't enjoy lighter profiled coffees have. So that, of course, being the brightness, that's a little bit more toned down. The very intense fruit profiles, those are also toned down. So it gives it a little bit more of a traditional coffee feel in general. And I know that that does appeal to a lot of people that do tend to prefer their slightly more developed coffees. And that's the best direction I can point somebody towards in this one, and the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Chito community, wash processed Ecuador from Resident Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.